My fiancé disappeared on our wedding day, and I found out I was his financial plan, not his plan to build a family with. My wedding day actually started weirdly calm considering how it ended, which is probably why I did not see the disaster coming even when the little red notification popped up on my phone. I was standing in this overlit dressing room at the venue, half zipped into my dress, with my best friend trying to fix a loose curl in my hair. And for some reason, my first thought when the phone buzzed was that my mother was probably complaining about parking or food temperature or whatever else she could find to stress me out. I remember laughing when I reached for the phone, making some joke about her never letting me have a peaceful moment, and then my thumb opened the message and the joke just kind of died in my throat so quickly, it felt like someone had put a hand around my neck. The text from my fiancé was short and painfully clear. No emojis, no explanations, just a handful of words that slammed into my chest like a physical hit. He wrote that he could not do it, that he was not coming, that he was sorry and that it was better this way, and that he hoped one day I would understand. That was it. Years of dating, months of planning, loans and deposits and family drama, all boiled down to a few lines that looked like he was canceling a dinner reservation instead of our entire future. For a second, I honestly thought it was some kind of twisted prank, that he was going to walk in with a camera crew and yell that this was a surprise or a joke. Because there was no way someone who just told me that he loved me last night would cancel our wedding by text about 40 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start. I must have read that message 10 times in a row because the words kept blurring and sliding off the screen. My hands started shaking so much I had to sit down before my knees gave out. And my best friend kept asking what was wrong, but my mouth would not cooperate. My brain started doing this weird thing where it zoomed in on tiny details that did not matter, like the fact that my nail polish had a chip on one finger or that there was a stray thread on the hem of my dress. Meanwhile, my whole life was obviously collapsing in slow motion, and my body just refused to catch up emotionally. I could hear guests laughing out in the hall, music playing softly from the speakers, someone dropping a tray in the kitchen and swearing, all these normal sounds of a normal wedding day while my phone screen kept screaming that nothing was normal anymore. When I finally managed to say the words out loud, my voice came out so flat that my friend thought I was joking at first. I told her he was not coming, that he had canceled, that the wedding was off, and she just stared at me with the brush still frozen in her hand like I had started speaking another language. She asked to see the message because I guess she needed physical proof that anyone could be that cruel, and then her whole face changed when she read it. Her eyes filled with this mix of rage and pity, which is honestly one of the worst combinations to receive when you are in a white dress and your mascara is already hanging by a thread. She knelt in front of me and kept saying we would figure it out, that we could still breathe, that I should not do anything dramatic, which of course made my brain immediately go to all the dramatic possibilities available. I know this is the part of the story where a sensible person would say, they quietly canceled everything, went home, cried with a tub of ice cream, and started therapy the next day. That is not what happened. I sat there thinking about the loan I had taken out to pay for this venue, the money my parents had grudgingly chipped in while reminding me monthly that I better not waste it, the relatives who had flown in from other states, the stack of gifts already piled on the table in the lobby, and something inside me snapped in a way that felt both reckless and strangely clear. I was humiliated, yes, but underneath that there was this sharp wave of anger that he got to just walk away with a text while I was the one left holding the bill. The dress. The entire circus. When my friend stepped out to talk to the coordinator, I got up and wandered down the hallway like a ghost, not really seeing anything until I almost walked straight into him. He was leaning against the wall near the back entrance, straightening his tie, totally unaware of the bomb that had just gone off in my phone. My fiancé's best friend, his roommate from college, the guy who had always been weirdly protective of me in every fight, the one who would walk me to my car after group dinners and check if I got home safe. He looked up and smiled in that automatic, polite way before his expression shifted into concern when he saw my face and the phone still clutched in my hand. He asked if I was okay, and I laughed, which probably disturbed him because it did not sound like a normal laugh at all. I just handed him the phone without saying a word and watched his eyes move across the screen. His jaw tightened in this way I had seen before whenever my fiancé crossed a line. But this time it went further, his whole body tensing. He whispered a curse under his breath and asked when the message came, and when I told him it had been only a few minutes earlier, he ran a hand through his hair and looked like he wanted to punch a wall. I remember thinking that of all the people in that building, he was probably the only one who truly knew the worst sides of my ex and still had tried to warn me in his own quiet way. The thing about being betrayed in such a public and humiliating way is that your brain stops following the normal script of what is reasonable. You start grabbing for anything that feels like control. I heard myself ask him, almost casually, if he had known this was coming, and he immediately said no, that if he had even suspected, he would have told me. He would have dragged my ex here himself. He kept saying how sorry he was, how I did not deserve this, how he had never liked the way my ex talked about money and pressure and getting his life back after the wedding. And something clicked in my head because I suddenly realized I had seen all those tiny flashes of discomfort on his face for years and ignored them. Maybe it was the dress, maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe I was losing my mind, but I looked at him and said very calmly that I was not willing to be the pathetic bride who got left at the altar by text while everyone whispered about it for years. I told him I was not going to waste the ceremony, the food, the music, the flowers, the entire evening, just because one coward backed out. The words came out before I could fully process them, but once they were hanging in the air, I could not pull them back. I said that if my ex did not want to stand at the front of that room with me, someone else could. Then I asked him if he had feelings for me beyond friendship, because I had seen the way he looked at me when he thought I was not paying attention, and I was tired of pretending I had not noticed. His face went a little pale when I asked that, like I had ripped open a door he had been leaning against for years. He tried to deflect at first, saying this was not the time, that I was in shock, that I would regret any decision made in the middle of this chaos. I told him I already regretted spending years with someone who could cancel our wedding with a paragraph, so my bar for regret was pretty high at the moment. Finally, he admitted, in this small, hoarse voice, that yes, he had been in love with me for a long time, that he had tried to bury it, that he hated himself for not telling me sooner, especially when he started to see just how transactional my ex was about the marriage. I stood there in my dress, staring at him, and the ridiculousness of the situation almost made me laugh again. Here I was, the bride without a groom, offering myself a replacement like I was swapping out a part in some broken machine. But it did not feel like that inside my chest. It felt like choosing not to let my ex control the narrative of my life, not even in his absence. I told him I wanted to walk down that aisle, not because I was desperate to be married to anyone, but because I refused to be the girl everyone remembered for collapsing and canceling everything while 150 people watched. When I asked if he would stand up there with me, stand up, not as a legal husband, but as someone who was willing to promise that he would be there while I tried to rebuild whatever came next, he hesitated so hard I could see the war happening behind his eyes. He said it was insane, that people would think we had planned it, that it would look like betrayal on top of betrayal, but also that he had never seen me look so certain in all the time he had known me. He admitted that he had tried to warn me about my ex, but every time he got close, I would shut him down because I did not want to hear anything that did not match the picture of the perfect fiancé in my head. He said he felt guilty for not pushing harder when he suspected things about money and messages and shady behavior, that maybe if he had been braver, we would not be standing here in this mess. I told him I was not asking him to save me, that I was asking him to stand next to me so I did not have to stand in front of our friends and family alone, and explain that I had been abandoned like a package on the wrong porch. I said we could figure everything else out later, the legal stuff, the relationship, all of it, but right now I needed someone who was actually willing to be there. He finally nodded, slowly, like a man signing a contract he wrote for himself, and said that if I was truly sure, if this was coming from a place of self-respect and not pure revenge, he would stand with me. Walking toward the ceremony room felt like walking into a storm I had chosen on purpose. My friend met us halfway and looked between us with wide eyes, and I could see the questions forming on her face. I explained in the fastest, most chaotic summary possible what had just happened, and she stared at me like I had lost my mind, but also like she understood why. She said that if I was going to do this, I needed to own it with my whole chest. No apologizing, no shrinking, because otherwise the crowd would eat me alive. She squeezed my hand and told me she would back me up no matter what, even if we both ended up as the cautionary tale people whispered about for the next decade. Before anyone sat down in neat rows, I actually walked into the cocktail area and asked the DJ to cut the music so I could use the microphone. I told everyone that the groom had just texted to say he was not coming, that I was not going to pretend everything was fine, and that I understood completely if people wanted to leave. There was this long, awful minute where nobody moved, and then my ex's entire family stood up and walked out together, followed by a chunk of other guests who clearly wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. The people who stayed did it on purpose, not because they were trapped, and that detail still matters to me more than any of the photos from that day. When the doors to the ceremony room opened, I could feel the air shift as everyone turned to look at me. The music that was playing did not fit the mood anymore. But nobody had had time to change it. So there I was, walking toward the front with my almost husband, now suddenly partner, standing where the groom was supposed to be. My parents' eyes hit me like lasers, my mother's mouth pressed into a tight line, my father whispering something that made her eyes widen. And on the left side, where my ex's family had been earlier, there was a block of empty chairs that looked louder than any shouting. I took the microphone from the stand before anyone else could speak, and felt the weight of the room sit on my shoulders. I told everyone, in a voice that shook at first but then grew steadier, that the groom had sent me a message a few minutes earlier saying he was not coming. I did not read it out loud, partly because I was not going to give him that much power, and partly because I did not trust myself not to choke on the words. I said I was not going to ask everyone to go home, that the food was paid for. The music was ready. People had taken time off work and traveled, and I refused to let one person's cowardice ruin the whole night. Then I told them that the man standing at the front with me had chosen to step up, that we were going to have a symbolic ceremony instead of a legal one, a promise between two people to support each other through whatever ridiculous hurricane this decision would cause. I could hear gasps and whispers and the kind of low hum you get when people smell gossip. Someone from the remaining crowd shouted that this had to be some kind of stunt, that I must have planned it all along. A few other voices joined in with similar accusations, but they were quickly drowned out by people shushing them, telling them to let us speak. The friend who had agreed to perform the ceremony cleared their throat and, after a quick whisper from me, explained that what we were about to do had no immediate legal power, that nothing was being filed that day, that it was essentially a public commitment, not a marriage in the technical sense. That calmed a few people, but enraged others even more, because somehow the lack of legal paperwork made it feel more dramatic, like we were performing our emotional train wreck for their entertainment. I could see some guests nodding in support, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few people actually got up and walked out before we even started, muttering things that sounded a lot like the words crazy and desperate. We went through the motions of the ceremony with this weird mixture of sincerity and surreal awareness. When it was time to say something like vows, I did not talk about forever or destiny or soulmates. I talked about choosing not to disappear just because someone else decided I was disposable. I said that he had seen me at my lowest, in this exact moment, and still chose to stand beside me, and that counted for more than promises made in comfortable times. He spoke too, voice low and a little rough, admitting that he had been a coward for too long, watching from the sidelines while my ex turned our relationship into some kind of financial plan, and that he was done being silent, even if stepping up made him look like the villain in some people's stories. By the time we did the symbolic ring exchange, the room had split into 3 groups. There were the people clapping and wiping their eyes, clearly the ones who loved drama but also genuinely cared about me. Then there were the ones staring with tight, judgmental faces, mentally writing their own version of events to retell later. Finally, there were the empty chairs of those who had left, which honestly hurt more than I expected, because every empty seat was another person choosing my ex's absence over my attempt to salvage some dignity. The reception that followed felt like walking through a minefield in heels. Every table was a different vibe. Some people hugged me and whispered that I was brave, that I was doing what they never would have had the courage to do. Others pulled me aside and suggested I should have just canceled, gone home, licked my wounds in private instead of dragging everyone into this twisted alternate ending. My parents took turns approaching me with tight smiles, asking if I was sure, if I had lost my mind, if this was about love or about money already spent. I could see my mother calculating how this would sound when she told her friends, how she could spin it so she was the victim of my chaos instead of one of the reasons I needed so badly to prove I would not fall apart. My new partner for the night, who I guess technically became my boyfriend in that moment, even though the label felt way too small for what we had just done, stayed close but kept this uneasy distance. Like he was still asking himself if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. We danced once, awkwardly, because people expected it, and I could feel him tense whenever we caught someone's phone pointed at us. He kept saying we could still backtrack on the legal side, that nothing was filed, that if I woke up tomorrow and decided this was all a grief response, we could reset back to friendship, or whatever version of friendship you have left after you share vows in front of your families. At some point, much later, when most of the older relatives had gone home and it was mainly younger friends lingering at the bar, he pulled me into one of the smaller side rooms with a look on his face that told me he had been holding something in all night. He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a bit, and then handed it to me like someone passing over a lit match. On the screen, there were message screenshots, some with my ex. Some in group chats, some from late nights when they had been talking about me without realizing they were leaving a paper trail. I read lines about getting through 2 years so he could secure a solid settlement, jokes about marrying a walking savings account, comments about how his ex, the musician who always needed help, was the one who made him feel alive while I would make sure the bills got paid. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up on the spot. He explained that he had started saving those messages months earlier, when he realized my ex was not just venting, but actually outlining a plan, talking about manipulating prenups, about making sure certain assets stayed in his name while others were joint, mentioning debts I knew nothing about. He admitted that he had not saved everything because it felt wrong to snoop, but the bits he kept were the ones that made his skin crawl. He had tried, in his way, to warn me by asking questions and making comments, but every time he got too close, I would shut it down, accusing him of being jealous or paranoid. We ended up in the hotel suite that was supposed to be my wedding night room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the perfectly arranged rose petals like they belonged to someone else's life. He asked if I wanted him to delete the messages so I did not have to see them again, but I told him to send them to me instead. I wanted the receipts, not so I could post them publicly, at least not yet, but because I needed to know I was not crazy for feeling what I was feeling. My phone buzzed over and over as the screenshots came through. In between them, messages from my ex started popping up again from a different number. Long paragraphs about panic, about family pressure, about how he had made a mistake and wanted to talk. I did not respond that night. I watched the notifications stack up and then turned my phone face down on the nightstand. We talked until dawn instead, about who we were outside of my ex, about how we had gotten here, about whether anything real could possibly grow out of this mess, or if we were just trauma bonded. I admitted that part of me was using him as a shield from humiliation, and he admitted that part of him was using me as proof that he was not as passive as he had always been. It was not romantic or cute. It was honest in a way that scared both of us. At some point, exhausted and still in my dress, I fell asleep with my head on his shoulder and the taste of cake and bitterness still in my mouth. The next morning, the wedding coordinator knocked on the door with a tight professional smile, asking about checkout times and leftover decorations and how we wanted to handle the cake that had barely been touched. It felt absurd to talk about centerpieces and deposit refunds when my entire relationship status had flipped inside out in less than a day. My new partner and I looked at each other across the room, both of us with that shell-shocked face you get after a car crash, and we both started laughing again, the kind of laughter that sounds suspiciously close to crying. We decided to still go on the honeymoon trip, which I know sounds insane, but the flights and the hotel were already paid with a loan that had my name on it. Canceling everything would not magically put the money back in my account, and the idea of sitting at home answering calls from relatives and neighbors asking what happened made me physically ill. My parents were furious about it, of course. My mother called to say it was inappropriate to go on the trip with someone else, that I was disrespecting the seriousness of what had happened. I reminded her calmly that the man who disrespected the seriousness of it was the one who skipped town after texting me, not the one who stayed and faced the fallout right next to me. On the flight, I spent most of the time staring out the window and pretending we were just two random people going on vacation instead of whatever we had become. He kept checking on me, asking if I was eating enough, if I felt okay, if I wanted to talk or just sit in silence. We ended up somewhere between talking and silence, narrating small stupid things like how weird it felt to still be wearing our wristbands from the reception and how my hair still smelled like hairspray and stress. There were moments when we would both get quiet and I could feel the heavy unspoken question hovering between us. What are we going to be after this trip ends and real life comes crashing back? The week away was not some magical reset. We argued more than I expected, mostly about what our story would look like to the outside world. He was convinced we needed to make our relationship official quickly, not just emotionally, but legally, to show that we were serious and not just a rebound scandal. He kept saying that real commitment would help stabilize everything, especially if my ex decided to escalate his drama. I pushed back hard, reminding him that my original plan had been to marry someone who casually plotted to use me for money, and I was not going to make another giant legal decision just to prove a point on a social media app. In between those conversations, we went through the practical mess my ex had left behind. Sitting in the hotel room one afternoon, he pulled out some more bank statements and messages he had screenshotted, showing me transfers that had been made from the joint account my ex had convinced me to open months earlier, so we could practice managing money together like a team. There were withdrawals that looked like rent payments, transfers marked as loans, and a few expensive purchases that definitely never showed up at our apartment. My gut clenched when I recognized the timing lining up with the crisis posts his ex used to make on her profile about almost getting evicted and needing help. I logged into the account myself and went back through the statements, feeling my chest tighten more with every line. There it was, plain as day. Chunks of money leaving the account, sometimes just before he would tell me he could not cover his part of the utilities that month. He had been covering someone else's life with my savings, and then letting me think I was unstable for worrying about our finances. It was like finding a second betrayal tucked neatly inside the first. I did cry then. Ugly, hiccuping sobs that I tried to smother in a pillow so the guests in neighboring rooms would not hear. And he sat beside me with this helpless look on his face like he wanted to fix it, but knew he could not. We made a decision by the end of that week that felt both responsible and unsatisfying. We were not going to sign any legal paperwork yet. No courthouse, no license, no name changes. We would go home as whatever we were, something between best friends and partners, and see if anything stable could be built once the dust settled. It was strange to make such a grown-up decision while still sharing a hotel bed with someone who knew what my ex had called me behind my back. But I think deep down we both knew that if we rushed into a legal marriage out of fear and pride, we would eventually resent each other, and I was exhausted from being tied to men through resentment. Back home, reality hit faster than jet lag. I could not stay in the apartment we had shared. Too many memories. His energy still lingering in every corner. My new partner and I found a smaller place across town, one bedroom for us and space for a nursery. Moving out of that old apartment felt like shedding skin I had outgrown. My ex, who had apparently spent that week sending me wall of text after wall of text, switched tactics when I did not respond. The messages became shorter and more aggressive, then morphed into indirect posts on his social media, vague statuses about betrayal and loyalty, and how some people reveal who they really are when the money is on the table. Mutual friends started messaging me with screenshots, asking what was going on, if it was true that I had run off with his best friend, if he really had never sent that text and I had made it up to justify some kind of affair. I finally agreed to meet him once, in a coffee shop we used to go to every Sunday. I picked that place on purpose because it was public, because the staff knew us, because I needed the safety blanket of neutral territory. I got there early, ordered a drink I barely touched, and waited with my printed screenshots in a folder inside my bag. When he walked in, my body went tense in this automatic way, like muscle memory of leaning in for a kiss. Even though that was obviously not happening, seeing him in person after everything almost broke my resolve because he looked exactly the same, which felt obscene. He did not look like a villain or a mastermind. He just looked like a tired man in a nice shirt who had no idea how much damage he had caused. He started talking before he even sat down, spilling out excuses about panic attacks and cold feet and how he had felt suffocated by the expectations of a wedding rather than the idea of being with me. He said his therapist, who I did not know he had told him he needed to be honest with himself about not being ready, and that he thought canceling at the last minute would hurt less than going through with it and divorcing later. I listened without interrupting for longer than I thought I could manage, letting him dig his own hole deeper with every word. Then I slid the folder across the table and told him to read. Watching his face as he took in the messages and bank statements was like watching a mask crack. He tried to play it off at first, saying it was dark humor, that men vent to each other in gross ways they do not mean, that he never would have really gone through with any scheme. When I pointed out the exact days the money left the account, the dates that lined up with his ex's public crises, the gifts and bills and debt payments that matched his own words, his voice started to shake. He tried to grab my hand and I pulled away, not in a dramatic movie slap kind of way, but in this small, exhausted motion that said I was finally done being handled. I told him that I would be pursuing whatever legal options I had to get back at least some of what he had taken, that I had already spoken to a lawyer, that the screenshots and statements were saved in multiple places. I told him I did not care if he apologized, if he claimed mental health issues, if he blamed his upbringing or his stress. None of it changed the fact that he had turned me into an investment strategy. He accused me of setting him up by keeping the messages. And I laughed, genuinely laughed, because the irony of him screaming about privacy after weaponizing our entire relationship financially was just too much. Leaving that coffee shop felt like walking out of a courtroom after testifying. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt drained, like my bones were heavy and my skin did not fit quite right. I paid for both our drinks on my way out, not because I wanted to be kind, but because I wanted the symbolism. I refused to let him spin some story about how I had left him stranded with the bill, literally or metaphorically. When I got outside, I sat in my car for a long time, letting the air conditioning run, staring at my reflection in the window, and barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. If the story ended there, it would have been messy but simple. But my ex did not know how to leave anything alone. Within days, there were more posts on his profile, more vague accusations about betrayal and humiliation, and people who care more about optics than about mental health. Then came the video. A friend sent it to me, warning me before I opened it that I should probably be sitting down. In the video, he talked for almost an hour, telling his version of events in this calm, mournful tone that made him sound like the wounded hero of some indie movie. He painted me as controlling, obsessed with appearances and money, implied that I had emotionally abused him by pushing for the wedding, hinted that my new relationship had started long before that day. He never mentioned the text message. He glossed over the financial details by calling them private matters blown out of proportion, and he barely acknowledged the planning of any scheme, claiming that friends say stupid things to each other when they are stressed. The comment section was a war zone. Some people defended him fiercely, saying they had always seen me as intense and materialistic, that it was obvious he had been pressured into the wedding. Others called him out, asked where the proof was, reminded everyone that canceling by text was proof enough of his character. My name stayed off the screen, but everyone who knew us knew exactly who he was talking about. At work, things started to get awkward in ways that had nothing to do with my actual performance. I worked as an account manager at a marketing company, and part of my job was maintaining relationships with clients who wanted to trust the person handling their campaigns. My ex tried to contact me at work, calling the main line repeatedly until someone transferred him. When I refused to take the call, he sent emails to my work address, then started messaging colleagues through a professional networking site asking them to convince me to talk to him. It was harassment, but the cowardly kind, from behind screens. My supervisor finally called me in after the front desk logged the calls and complaints for days in a row. She used a lot of sympathetic language, but the message was simple. The promotion I had been in line for was going to be delayed until things settled down. That phrase made me want to scream, because nothing about my reality had any intention of settling. I filed my first police report after that incident, hands shaking as I answered questions about past behavior and current concerns. The officer was patient but clearly overworked, explaining restraining orders and paperwork and timelines in a flat tone that made me feel like just another case file in a drawer. It took weeks to even get a temporary order in place, and in that time my ex kept hovering around the edges of my life like a ghost that refused to realize it was dead. In the middle of all this, my new partner and I had our first real blow-up. He wanted to go nuclear publicly, to release all the receipts, to call out every lie in the video, to drag my ex through the same mud I was drowning in. I wanted to pick my battles, to keep some privacy, to let the lawyer handle the legal angles while I tried to hold on to what was left of my job and sanity. We yelled, said things that sounded like accusations even when they were meant as fears. Both of us stretched so thin that everything felt like an attack. A few weeks after that ridiculous symbolic ceremony, because the universe has a messed up sense of timing, I found out I was pregnant. I was only a few weeks along when the doctor told me, but I felt like I had been carrying the weight of it already without knowing. Sitting in that medical office, listening to her talk about vitamins and appointments and stress management, my brain ping-ponged between excitement and pure terror. When I told him that night, he looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. He caught himself quickly, tried to smile, said he loved me and wanted this with me, but I could see the fear in the corners of his eyes. We were barely stable as a couple. We were in the middle of what felt like a public scandal, and now there was a baby in the mix. His instinct was to fix it by locking everything down. He brought up marriage again, this time with even more urgency. He said he did not want our child to grow up in a story where people doubted their family structure or whispered about timelines. He started talking about insurance and legal rights and security in that practical way that is so easy to confuse with love. I pushed back again, harder this time, telling him that I refused to drag a child into a commitment made out of panic. The argument that followed was one of the ugliest we have ever had. He accused me of being stubborn just to prove I could not be controlled. I accused him of wanting to erase his guilt about betraying his friend by turning our mess into a fairy tale family unit. We did go to a lawyer together, though. We needed to. The financial mess my ex had left behind was not going to clean itself up, and I wanted to know if the money he had siphoned from our account could actually be recovered. The lawyer, a tired-looking woman who had clearly seen more family drama than any human should, listened to our story without much visible reaction. She asked pointed questions, took notes, told us what would be easy and what would be a nightmare. She said we had a decent shot at getting back at least a portion of what he had taken, especially with the documentation we had. She also warned us that it would not be quick, that we needed to brace ourselves for hearings and delays and the constant reopening of wounds. As if that was not enough, my ex's video kept circulating. It never went viral in a massive way, but in our circle, in our town, on those local gossip pages that thrive on other people's misery, it might as well have. Strangers who recognized me from the background of old photos would give me looks in grocery stores, at the gym, at the park. Some looked sympathetic, some looked gleeful, some looked like they were trying to guess if the baby bump they thought they saw was his or my new partner's. I tried to stay off that social media app, but people kept sending me screenshots anyway, convinced I needed to know who was on our side and who was not. At some point, we realized silence was not working for us anymore. The lawyer advised us to keep things measured, but she also said that letting his story sit as the only version in public was not helping. So we posted our own statement. It was shorter, less dramatic, just a picture of the text message where he canceled, and a brief caption explaining that he had left me by text minutes before the ceremony, that the so-called best friend had stepped in only after that the financial issues existed and were being addressed legally. We did not drag his mental health. We did not spill every painful detail. We just offered enough truth to show that his version was, at best, selective. The reaction was exactly what you would expect. People who already believed me felt vindicated. People who worshipped him accused me of faking the screenshot, of doctoring the timestamps, of being manipulative enough to set him up. A decent chunk of people landed somewhere in the middle, shrugging and deciding that everyone involved was messy, and therefore equally guilty. It was weirdly freeing to realize that no amount of proof would convince some people. Once you accept that a certain percentage of the crowd is committed to misunderstanding you, you stop wasting energy trying to win them over. Meanwhile, the legal process moved slowly, like everything in that system does. The restraining order finally went through after a series of hearings where I had to sit 10 feet away from my ex, while he acted baffled that I felt unsafe. The judge granted it, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe without checking every car that drove past my building. That peace lasted until the night the front desk called to say there was an envelope waiting for me. Inside was a handwritten letter from him, several pages long, apologizing and justifying in equal measure, ending with a request for a loan because he was out of work and had nowhere to stay. I did not answer, obviously. I gave the letter to my lawyer as evidence that he still did not understand boundaries. Emotionally, though, it messed with me more than I wanted to admit. Part of me still remembered the version of him I had loved, the one who brought me soup when I was sick and stayed up late talking about stupid movies. Knowing that that version and the man who turned me into a financial exit plan were the same person made my brain feel like static. About 2 months later, my best friend called me with a voice that sounded like she was bracing herself. She told me that my ex had been hospitalized after what his family described as a breakdown. Apparently, they had found him in their basement, half catatonic, surrounded by bills and empty bottles and a laptop open to comment sections he should not have been reading. They checked him into a psychiatric program. His mother reached out to me, leaving this voicemail where she cried and begged me to consider visiting him, saying it might help him stabilize, that he was talking about me nonstop, stuck in a loop. I wrestled with that for days. My partner, who had once wanted to set his phone on fire, seemed weirdly shaken by the news too. He had lost a friend in this, no matter how toxic that friendship had been by the end. We went back and forth about whether seeing my ex would be healing or harmful. My therapist, who I had finally started seeing regularly because I was tired of trying to untangle this mess alone, told me I needed to decide based on what was best for my mental health, not based on some imagined responsibility to provide closure for a man who had blown up my life. I ran it by my lawyer first, and we made sure the visit was arranged in a way that would not violate the order. In the end, we went. I will not pretend it was noble. It was a mixture of curiosity, guilt, fear, and some stubborn desire to look him in the eye one last time in a controlled environment. The clinic was quiet and smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee. When he walked into the visitor room, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically. His eyes were a little dull from whatever medication he was on. He smiled when he saw me, then froze when he noticed my partner sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly on my knee. My ex started apologizing almost immediately. He talked about childhood trauma, about pressure, about feeling trapped, about hating himself for the way he handled things. He said he was ashamed of the video, that he had been in a bad place and lashed out, that he regretted turning strangers into judges of our private life. He cried. It was not pretty crying either. It was messy and hard to watch. For a second, my heart tried to soften, because empathy is a stubborn thing. But then he started wrapping his apologies around little barbs, saying he never would have snapped like that if I had not pushed so hard for the wedding, if I had not been so focused on every detail, if his friend had not taken advantage of the situation. That was my line. I realized in that moment that he still saw himself as the main victim in the story. Yes, he was hurting. Yes, he was clearly unwell. But buried in every sorry was a hidden accusation that someone else had pushed the first domino. I told him that I hoped he got the help he needed, that I did not wish him harm, but that whatever connection we had was over, not just romantically, but in every possible form. Then I got up and left, my partner following silently. In the parking lot, we both stood there for a long moment, staring at the building, feeling the weight of 10 years of intertwined lives finally loosen a little. Life did not magically become peaceful after that, but the drama started to shift from explosive events to slow, grinding repairs. The civil case about the money moved forward in fits and starts. There were hearings and delays and more paperwork than I thought possible for what seemed like a simple concept. He took my money. I wanted it back. My job stabilized a bit. Some clients bailed when the gossip was hottest, but others stuck around, either because they did not care or because they had their own messy lives and recognized a fellow human disaster when they saw one. I worked hard, not just at being good at my job, but at being boring professionally, so that eventually my name in the office would be associated more with reliable deliverables than with dramatic stories. At home, we tried to build something like a normal routine. The pregnancy forced a kind of discipline on our chaos. There were doctor appointments and budgeting and conversations about childcare instead of just about lawyers and rumors. We still fought, sometimes loudly, sometimes about old wounds that refused to die. He struggled with guilt about his role in all of it, worried that our child would grow up hearing that their father had once been the best friend of the man who hurt their mother. I struggled with trust, with wondering if I was capable of choosing partners who did not secretly see me as a ladder or a shield. About 7 months after that ridiculous symbolic ceremony, we did finally get legally married, and by then, I was about 7 months pregnant. It did not happen in some grand romantic gesture. We were at the county office dealing with paperwork for insurance, parental documents, and pre-registration stuff for the hospital. And at some point, we looked at each other and realized that emotionally, we had already chosen each other in all the ways that mattered. The legal part was catching up. We stood in a small, bland room with a bored clerk, said the simplest vows imaginable, signed our names, and walked out married in a way that felt strangely more solid than the elaborate performance had ever promised to be. Our daughter was born about 2 months after we signed those papers, a little earlier than expected after a stressful few weeks where my blood pressure refused to behave. The labor was long and messy and absolutely not the cinematic scene people like to post about. When she finally came out, tiny but loud, something in my chest shifted again. Holding her, I felt both more fragile and more grounded than I had in years. My ex sent a short message through the lawyer after hearing the news, just a sentence congratulating us and wishing the baby health. It was the first communication from him that did not try to rewrite history or tug on guilt. And honestly, that was a relief. The civil case eventually ended in a settlement. He agreed to pay back $12,000 over 3 years, which was roughly half of what he had taken from our joint account. After attorney fees and taxes and whatever else the system decided it needed, the amount we actually saw was almost symbolic. For a while, that infuriated me. I wanted the money, obviously, but I also wanted the principle of it to feel bigger. Over time, I realized what mattered more was the official acknowledgement that he had done something wrong, something that required restitution. It was a line in a document that said I had not imagined the whole thing. 3 years after our daughter was born, she was running around a park on a sunny afternoon when I heard a very familiar voice say my name. I turned, and there he was, sitting on a bench, looking worn out but steadier somehow. He stood up, hands visible and empty, like he wanted to show he had no intention of causing trouble. My husband, because it still feels strange sometimes to use that word about the man who once stood at the altar as a stand-in, moved closer to me instinctively, not aggressive, but clearly protective. My ex told us he had moved back to town a few months earlier for a job in a small accounting office. I asked if his family knew he was back. He shook his head and said they barely spoke anymore, that they blamed him for the embarrassment, the hospital stays, and the financial mess. His mother had sent him one card after he got out of the program, but that was it. He said he was still in therapy, still on medication, still working through his mess. He looked at our daughter, who had wandered over because that is what toddlers do. and his face softened in this way that was complicated to watch. He said she was beautiful, then quickly corrected himself and said he hoped that was not overstepping. He did not ask to hold her or for pictures or anything like that. He just nodded and said he finally understood what he had thrown away, not just a relationship, but an entire possible life. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. It was civil, awkward, full of small silences. When he walked away, I did not feel the rush of anger or the painful squeeze of nostalgia I had expected. I mostly felt tired and, weirdly, indifferent. It was like my brain had finally filed him under past, instead of keeping him in the active threats folder. Later that night, lying in bed with my husband snoring softly beside me and our daughter's monitor buzzing quietly on the nightstand, I realized that indifference was the closest thing to peace I was probably ever going to get from that situation. What almost nobody ever asks about is the part in the middle, the boring-looking years that were not actually boring at all, the stretch of time where we had to turn this wild origin story into something that worked on a random Tuesday night when the trash needed to go out and the baby would not sleep. After the settlement was signed and the legal email slowly stopped, there was this strange quiet that did not feel peaceful at first. It felt like when a loud appliance finally turns off and you realize your ears are still ringing. I kept waiting for another message, another post, another twist, because my nervous system had gotten so used to constant alerts that normal days almost felt wrong. There were mornings when I would wake up already braced for impact, only to realize that the only thing on my schedule was a staff meeting and a prenatal checkup, and I did not quite know what to do with that kind of calm. My relationship with my parents did not magically transform either. For a long time, my mother told the story in a way that made her look like the long-suffering parent of a reckless daughter who apparently collected scandals the way other people collect mugs. She would tell people that I had been through a lot, that my heart was too big, that I was impulsive, and she somehow always forgot to mention that the man who abandoned me had also drained my savings while she kept asking if I really needed therapy or if I was just tired. At first, I tried to correct her every time, to jump in and give the factual version, but that turned every family gathering into a debate club. Eventually, I stopped arguing and just limited the audience. If someone genuinely wanted to know what had happened, I told them myself over coffee, without her narration over the top. There were also the small, unglamorous victories that I do not put in the headline when I tell the story, like the first time my husband and I got through a big argument without threatening to leave, or the first time we paid a bill from a savings account that was not tied in any way to my ex. We went to therapy, separately and together, not because we were on the verge of breaking up every week, but because we both knew our foundation had been poured in a storm. The therapist made us talk about things we had been avoiding, like the fact that the day he said yes at the altar was also the day he finally stopped avoiding his own feelings, and that it came with guilt he did not know where to put. She poked at my habit of bracing for abandonment even when he was just running late, and at his habit of overcompensating with big gestures whenever he felt even a little bit like the bad guy. Work changed, too. After a while, I realized that no matter how competent I was, there would always be colleagues in that first company who secretly saw me as the messy one, the woman from the wedding video and the ex-drama. It was not even malicious most of the time, just one more label stuck to my name. So I quietly started sending out resumes. Not in a frantic way, but in that slow, steady way you do when you are ready for a new chapter. When I finally switched to a different firm, one where almost nobody knew my personal history, it felt like stepping into a room without a spotlight on my back. Within a year at the new firm, I made senior account manager, a position equivalent to the promotion I had lost at my old company. This time, my advancement was based solely on my work, not on anyone's perception of my personal drama. I still disclosed the basics to my new manager because I did not want to hide it completely, but it was different telling the story as past context instead of as the latest episode of my current life. Our daughter grew from a tiny bundle in the hospital bassinet into this loud, opinionated little person who has no idea how complicated her origin story is. To her, the world is simple. She knows that her parents met at a wedding and that there was a mix-up with the original plan, which is the only way we can make it sound funny instead of tragic when she asks why there are pictures of her father in the wedding album even though the grown-ups keep joking about a missing groom. She loves the photo of me in the big dress twirling her around in our tiny living room many months later, more than any picture from the actual reception. When she runs around the house wearing a towel as a cape, yelling that she is saving the day, I sometimes have to bite back a weird laugh, because part of me still wants to argue that what I did back then was not exactly saving the day, even if people tell it that way now. We did end up doing a small vow renewal later, once the dust had truly settled and life had turned into something that looked almost normal from the outside. It was not some grand production, just a simple ceremony in a backyard with a rented arch and a playlist made on a random streaming app. Only the people who had actually stood by us through the worst were invited. My best friend, the one who saw the text on my wedding day with her own eyes, made a toast that was equal parts roast and love letter. She talked about how sometimes people burn the script because they are done being written as the side character in their own life. And I could feel my mother physically cringe when she realized that line was aimed at her favorite narrative. The vow renewal was not about rewriting history or pretending the original chaos had not happened. It was more like saying, okay, we did this wild thing for all the wrong reasons and some right ones. And instead of pretending it was a fairy tale, we are going to own how messy it was and still choose each other on a regular Tuesday, with no audience and no drama. Our daughter walked very seriously down the makeshift aisle, holding a tiny pillow with 2 simple rings, taking the job so seriously that she shushed my cousin for whispering. My ex was nowhere near that day, not in person and not as a topic, and that absence finally felt like a neutral fact instead of a jagged gap. Every once in a while, some distant acquaintance will bring up the old video or the screenshots, like they are referencing an episode of a show I starred in briefly. They will say something like, "I remember when all that happened, you were so strong." And I have to resist the urge to correct them and say that strength is not really the word for what I was. I was cornered, angry, heartbroken, stubborn, and yes, maybe a little brave, but it did not feel like a heroic moment. It felt like a very human one. The real strength, if there was any, showed up later, in the months where there were no cameras and no gossip pages, just bills and crying and uncomfortable conversations about trust and pride. Sometimes, late at night when the house is finally quiet and I am sitting at the kitchen table with a lukewarm drink, I still replay certain scenes in my head and wonder how different everything would be if I had made one small choice differently, if I had canceled the wedding politely and gone home, if I had listened to my husband when he tried to warn me months earlier and actually looked at the numbers. If I had stayed single for a while instead of stepping straight into another relationship under the brightest spotlight imaginable. There are versions of my life where I avoid some of the pain, where I keep my reputation cleaner, where fewer people feel entitled to have an opinion about my choices. There are also versions where I stay with a man who quietly sees me as a credit line instead of a partner. None of those hypothetical lives come with a guarantee of less heartbreak. They just come with different headlines. The funny thing is that the more time passes, the less I feel the need to defend every detail. In the beginning, I wanted everyone to understand exactly why I did what I did, to see each text and statement and court paper, to weigh the facts and declare a verdict. Now I mostly just want my little family to stay intact and reasonably healthy. I still find myself explaining it sometimes, especially when a new friend finally asks why my wedding photos look slightly off if they stare long enough, but it no longer feels like I am on trial. It feels more like I am describing a strange storm that blew through my life for a long stretch and then eventually moved on. Years later, when people hear the condensed version of my story, they tend to focus on the wedding day twist, like that was the main plot. They love the part where I walked down the aisle with someone else, where I refused to let myself be publicly humiliated, where I turned chaos into some half-romantic, half-unhinged move. They do not always want to hear about the months of legal paperwork, the nights of anxiety, the arguments, the therapy sessions, the awkward school events where I still occasionally catch someone whispering about that wedding. They want the headline, not the footnotes. But when I sit on my couch at night and think about everything, it is the footnotes that feel the most real. The way my best friend stayed even when she disagreed with my decisions, but knew I needed someone in my corner. The way my parents, as judgmental as they were at first, eventually babysat so we could go to court without bringing a toddler to a waiting room. The way my husband and I learned to fight without turning each other into enemies, to apologize without keeping score, to build something that did not rely on pretending our origin story was not a complete mess. If you had told me on that morning, when I first looked at my phone and saw those few cruel sentences, that this was where I would end up, I probably would have laughed in your face and then burst into tears. I used to think stability came from making all the right choices in the right order. Now I know it sometimes comes from making the most honest choice available in a terrible moment and then dealing with the consequences one day at a time. I am not proud of every decision I made, and I am sure there are people out there who still tell my story in a version where I am the villain. That is fine. They were not the ones who had to live it. I tell you all of this not because I think anyone should copy what I did, but because I refuse to be reduced to that girl who got dumped by text and either collapsed or turned into a meme. I was humiliated. Yes. I was also angry, impulsive, stubborn, reckless, and sometimes brave in ways that did not look pretty. I blew up my own life in order to avoid being quietly erased from it. In the end, I got something that looks suspiciously like a family out of the wreckage, but it is not a reward or proof that I did everything right. It is just the life that grew out of all those imperfect choices, and for better or worse, it is mine to live with every day.